Hello, and welcome to The Dreaming Scientist, a quiet place in deep space with softly spoken science for sleepy minds. Today, I will be talking about what would happen if all the ice on Earth melted and what effect it would have on our climate and our future. So sit back, relax, and let your thoughts carry you to sleep. But before you do that, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel, and thank you so much for being here. Also, comment down below where you are tuning in from. It is always fascinating to know where you guys are watching from. So what if all the ice on all melted? Imagine the planet without permanent ice. No mountain glaciers clinging to high valleys. No year-round sea ice in the Arctic. No green-white shield atop Greenland. And no sprawling Antarctic ice sheets. In physical terms, we are talking about melting virtually all land-based ice and letting the oceans integrate that water until they find a new equilibrium with gravity and the shape of the basins. Summed across Greenland, Antarctica, and the world's glaciers, the ultimate sea level equivalent is commonly estimated at roughly approximately 65 to 70 meters higher than today. Think of the ocean rising above present shorelines high enough to drown many of the world's coastal plains, river deltas, and continental shelves now exposed. Two framing cautions matter for a serious thought experiment. First, timescale. This is not a thing of decades. Even under aggressive warming, physically removing that much cold mass and draining it to the ocean is a multi-century to multi-millennial process involving heat transport into thick ice, dynamic ice stream behavior, carving, isostatic uplift of bedrock, and new circulation patterns in the oceans. In other words, nothing about all the ice is sudden on human calendars. What we are exploring is an end state that Earth could approach if warming were high and long-lived enough. Second, distribution. Where the water goes is not uniform. Sea level is a gravitational surface, not a neat bathtub line. The loss of a giant ice sheet changes both Earth's gravity field and the geoid, the shape the ocean surface naturally follows, so the rise is larger in some regions and smaller in others. With those constraints, the scenario still clarifies a lot about how our world works. Remove high albedo ice and you brighten nothing. You darken the planet, absorbing more sunlight where ice once reflected it. Remove tall cold domes and you soften pressure gradients that helped shape atmospheric circulation. Pour massive freshwater pulses into the sea and you alter stratification and currents that move heat and nutrients. Peel back frozen ground and you expose organic carbon to microbes. Finally, you free the crust from a multi-trillion-ton load, and Earth's elastic and viscous interior begins to rebound, tilting coastlines and subtly changing the length of day. The rest of this program moves from coastlines to geophysics to climates, and living systems to the human ledger, costs, adaptations, and the long patience such a reshaped planet would demand. With approximately 65 to 70 meters added to mean sea level, the familiar map of the world blurs and shifts. Continental outlines remain, but lowlands change character. The US Atlantic and Gulf coasts push far inland. Much of southern Florida becomes a shallow sound. The Mississippi Delta and its patchwork of levees drown into a broad estuary. The Chesapeake expands until it reads like an inland sea. In Europe, the North Sea migrates across the Netherlands and German lowlands despite heroic engineering. The Thames, Seine, Rhine, and Elbe valleys become long estuaries with new tidal prisms. Denmark fractures into archipelago. Egypt's Nile Delta retreats dramatically. Bangladesh, built on the Ganges-Brahmaputra-Meghna Braid Plain, loses vast acreage. Shanghai and parts of the Yangtze Basin sit at the margin of a newly embayed interior. Ho Chi Minh City and the Mekong Fan turn to shallow sea. Lagos, Alexandria, Basra, Mumbai, Kolkata, Guangzhou, Jakarta, Tokyo, New York, Miami, New Orleans, Amsterdam, Hamburg. The roll call of cities that would be relocated, terraced, or abandoned is long, because so many human settlements followed flat land, river mouths, and protected coasts. The losses are not just urban. Agricultural flats, rice in deltas, wheat on coastal plains, truck crops in alluvial fans are pushed inland. Salinization of shallow coastal aquifers spreads wherever salt wedges intrude upstream and upward. Ports move to the new shoreline, but navigability changes. Old harbours become deep water over drowned infrastructure, while former shelves now lie under tens of metres of ocean, changing shipping routes and wave climates. New estuaries proliferate where rivers meet the enlarged sea. New barrier islands take shape at the edge of wave energy and sediment supply. Some karst lowlands, pockmarked with sinkholes, develop complex drowned cave systems. Inland, the story flips somewhere else. The weight of ice removed from Greenland and Antarctica triggers glacial isostatic adjustment. Forebulge regions, places that had been pushed up by ice elsewhere, subside, while formerly glaciated land springs upward, making relative sea level fall in some high-latitude pockets even as the global mean rises. Cultural heritage is a quieter line in the tally. Coastal temples, graves, fortifications, and entire neighbourhoods lie below a permanent tide unless painstakingly moved or entombed behind dikes. Marshes and mangroves expand in other places, creating new heritage and new protections. In short, the new map is not an apocalypse, but a large translation. Shorelines move. Some countries gain inshore seas. Others lose coastal heartlands. Hundreds of millions of people and trillions in assets must shift upslope in a planned or chaotic migration that lasts generations. Sea level is a living, physical surface. When an ice sheet melts, it does three important things to that surface. First, it adds water. Second, it removes a gravitational attractor. Big ice sheets pull ocean water toward them, lose the ice, and nearby sea level can fall relative to the global mean, while far-field regions rise more than the average. These are sea level fingerprints. Melt Greenland, and the North Atlantic close to Greenland may see smaller rises or even a relative drop compared to elsewhere, while the southern hemisphere coasts get a supercharged share. Melt Antarctica, and the converse happens. Third, it lifts rock. The crust and mantle beneath former ice masses rebound over decades to millennia, while areas on the periphery subside, changing relative sea level and sometimes tilting entire regional coastlines by measurable amounts per century. Superimposed on this are dynamic topography changes in the ocean as winds and currents adjust, and thermal expansion as warming swells seawater. There is more. Move trillions of tons of mass from high latitudes to the global ocean, and you change Earth's moment of inertia, which must conserve angular momentum, so the length of day changes by tiny amounts, milliseconds, and the rotation axis shifts slightly relative to the crust, a form of true polar wander that geodesists can track. The geoid, the equipotential surface the ocean follows, also updates because the gravity field has been edited. Satellite altimeters would map a new lumpy but lawful ocean surface. These geophysical realities matter for where people live. A rule of thumb plus 70 meters everywhere map is good for a first gasp, but the pattern of rise and fall is textured. Some regions face well above the global mean, some below. Engineering must read those fingerprints to set design heights, because a wall built to a global mean could be underbuilt by several additional meters in a far-field target zone. And the lithosphere remembers. As Antarctica unweights, parts of its bed that now sit below sea level rebound upward. Other basins rebound less, potentially allowing new marine incursions under remaining ice in transitional phases. Even without a scientist's equations, the intuition is clear. All the ice melted is not only a bigger ocean, it is a rebalanced Earth, with water redistributed according to gravity, rock flexure, and rotation. Subtle forces that, integrated over centuries, reposition coasts and tweak the ticking of the planet's clock. Strip the planet of its great reflective caps, and you change the energy budget. Ice and snow boast high albedo, open ocean and dark rock do not. The instant impact of a permanently ice-free Arctic Ocean and deglaciated Greenland margin is more solar absorption in summer at high latitudes. Similarly, removing huge white plateaus from Antarctica darkens the austral surface. That extra energy does not sit politely. It moves as latent heat when evaporation climbs over larger, warmer seas, raising humidity everywhere and turning the hydrologic cycle's knob toward intensification. Wetter wets, drier dries, heavier downpours as warmer air holds and releases more water vapor. Massive freshwater outflow during the long transition also stratifies the upper ocean, especially in the North Atlantic, weakening the ability of surface waters to sink. That matters for the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, AMOC, the great conveyor that drags warm water north and returns cold water at depth. Sustained freshening tends to weaken it, altering sea surface temperatures, storm tracks, and regional climates from the Caribbean to Western Europe. In the Southern Ocean, changes in wind and buoyancy reshape the upwelling engine that ventilates deep waters with knock-ons for global carbon uptake. Remove summer sea ice, and you also remove a lid that used to suppress wave growth and heat exchange. The Arctic becomes a seasonal stormier sea, with fetch long enough to build significant swell that reaches new shorelines cut into ice-free coasts. The global pattern of monsoons responds to the new thermal contrast between land and ocean. Continents edged by broader, warmer shallow seas host monsoon systems that may migrate inland or intensify depending on topography and aerosol burdens. Cloud feedbacks cut both ways: low clouds in subtropics, high clouds in storm belts. But the direction of travel in a no-ice world is toward a warmer, wetter atmosphere with a different circulation skeleton. Add thermal expansion to the sea level tally as a warmer ocean occupies more volume. Meanwhile, the high-latitude jet streams and storm tracks wander as their baroclinic guards are rearranged by lost snow and ice, changing where mid-latitude droughts and deluges set up camp. None of these adjustments care about political borders. They transmit through pressure gradients and density surfaces, rearranging precipitation bands, agricultural zones, and coastal hazards even far from where the last berg melted. The end state is not meteorological anarchy. It is a new, logically connected climate whose reference points, freezing seasons, storm corridors, fog banks, trade wind cells, have shifted on the grand chessboard. Life is patient but particular. Free the Arctic and subarctic soils from long frost, and you unlock vast permafrost regions, exposing organic carbon that had been frozen for millennia to microbial decomposition. The result is carbon dioxide and methane releases that add to the greenhouse inventory, especially during the transition. Some thawed ground becomes thermokarst, collapsed pond-studded landscapes that alter hydrology and habitat. In the newly expanded coastal margins, ecosystems redraw themselves. Where gentle slopes meet the rising ocean, wetlands, marshes, mangroves, seagrass can migrate landward if sediment supply and space exist, building natural buffers for waves and nurseries for fish. Where seawalls or cliffs block them, wetlands drown in place, and the protection they offered is lost. River mouths transform into estuaries with larger tidal prisms and salinity gradients, changing biogeochemistry and fisheries. Some species retreat, others colonize. Coral reefs face a mixed sentence. Their stresses predate any hypothetical complete melt. Warming and acidification both impede calcification, but as coastlines flood, new shelf edges and clearer waters may create niches for reef growth in some basins, even as legacy reefs suffer. Offshore, altered winds and weaker internal tides in some regions reshape nutrient delivery to the surface, rebooting plankton communities that sit at the base of food webs. Oxygen minimum zones respond to warming and stratification, squeezing habitat for species that need well-ventilated water. Fisheries feel this through shifting ranges, earlier or later spawning windows, and the arrival of warm water species into newly temperate seas. Management chases moving targets, changing quotas, and gear to avoid bycatch in ecosystems that no longer match 20th century atlases. In mountains, glacier retreat removes seasonal meltwater subsidies that once buffered rivers through dry seasons. Some basins build reservoirs and groundwater storage to replace that timing service. But cold water species like salmonids lose thermal refugia unless forests, flow and shade are meticulously managed. Biodiversity does not collapse everywhere, it rearranges. New archipelagos born of drowned lowlands host endemism and speciation. New straits alter migration paths for marine mammals. Deserts retreat from old coastlines as humidity increases in a few places, while others dry under reorganized circulation. The headline is not "Life Ends," but "Ecology Edits." Earth's biomes, tuned to a Pleistocene beat of ice and interglacial, remix under a sustained interglacial that never refreezes, and the carbon cycle feedbacks, especially from soils and shallow shelves, set how far the climate moves before a new balance is found. For people, all the ice melted is not a single storm to outlast. It is a long project of civilization management. First comes water. Many megacities rely on mountain snow and ice as seasonal reservoirs. With glaciers gone, utilities must build storage, surface an aquifer, cut leakage, diversify sources, desalination where energy allows, and price water to reflect scarcity while protecting access. Food adjusts by latitude and logistics. Some coastal farmlands are lost, but higher latitude belts become longer season producers. Supply chains adapt with cold chain expansion and shifts in what grows where. Fisheries moving frontiers require transboundary treaties that can flex as stocks migrate. Law and science must travel together. Finance learns to model sea level fingerprints and glacial rebound, pricing coastal risk to regional patterns rather than bathtub maps, while insurers and reinsurers push for managed retreat and setback policies to reduce tail risk. Infrastructure follows. Ports, refineries, and power plants either move, elevate, or transform into offshore hubs. Some cities build living shorelines and surge-compatible boulevards. Others terrace historic cores and accept that outer districts become canals. The toughest choices are cultural. Sacred sites, cemeteries, waterfront neighborhoods, and entire ways of life bound to particular coasts cannot all be held in place. Societies must choose when to document and let go, when to encapsulate behind walls for another century, and when to translate heritage uphill, stone by stone. Migration policy becomes climate policy. Hundreds of millions gradually relocate over generations. The difference between humane order and disorder is planning, zoning safe corridors inland, financing housing and jobs, and treating migrants as future neighbours rather than temporary exceptions. Energy systems can help or hurt. Decarbonisation slows the approach to the end state. Abundance of clean power makes desalination, cooling, electrified transport, and vertical agriculture more feasible in newly crowded uplands. Governance matures toward adaptive pathways, plans with forks tied to observing systems that measure sea level pace, storm statistics, and ground motion, so choices are triggered by data rather than by denial or panic. Education and health fill in the human texture. New coasts need lifeguards, pilots, and estuary scientists. Inland cities need heat planning and tree canopy. Mental health services help communities grieve places they loved and grow into places they will love next. The clock for all of this is the key mercy. Centuries, not years. That time can be squandered in argument or invested in building a world that is livable higher up the slope, with room for marsh and memory both. The reality this scenario underlines is not fate but scale. Melt all the ice and earth remains home, but it demands a long, calm competence, engineering, law, culture and empathy, equal to a shoreline that decides at last to move. Antarctica is not one block of ice on simple rock. Much of West Antarctica sits on bedrock below sea level, and its glaciers flow through deep basins that open inland, exactly the configuration prone to marine ice sheet instability. In the centuries to millennia journey toward a no-ice world, the crucial theatre is the grounding line, the place where ice resting on bedrock begins to float as an ice shelf. Warm circumpolar deep water intruding onto the continental shelf can thin those floating shelves from below. Remove or weaken that buttress and the grounded ice behind it can accelerate seaward, lowering its surface, shifting the grounding line back into deeper basins, and setting up a self-reinforcing retreat. In our all-ice-melted end state, this process has run to completion. The Great West Antarctic outlets, Pine Island, Thwaites, Getz, Amundsen Sea Sector, have long since withdrawn. The Filchner Ronne and Ross shelves are gone, and the ocean floods far inland where a rebounding but still depressed crust cradles new seas. East Antarctica, bigger and higher, yields more grudgingly. Yet given enough warmth and time, coastal sectors with marine basins, the Wilkes and Aurora subglacial systems, also surrender, bleeding fresh water into a southern ocean whose salinity, density structure, and wind-driven upwelling are fundamentally altered. The Antarctic Circumpolar Current, the world's mightiest flow, threads a different archipelago, where ice shelves once launched tabular bergs, rocky headlands now intercept swell, throwing lee eddies that seed rich biological hotspots. With ice cliffs gone, katabatic winds still scream off a high cold interior for a time. But the interior is no longer ice. It is a frigid plateau slowly darkening as talus and lakes grow, then moderating as albedo falls and summers warm. The southern annular mode, the belt of westerlies encircling the continent, responds to the loss of bright ice and to ozone recovery in ways that reposition storm belts and sea ice seasonality before sea ice finally vanishes. Biogeography follows the physics. Penguin species that once bred on fast ice and ice-bound coasts retreat or reinvent on rocky shores. Krill nurseries tied to the underside of seasonal sea ice shrink, while salp blooms pulse through warmer, stratified waters. Baleen whales shift foraging corridors as fronts migrate. In the long tail of deglaciation, isostatic rebound lifts some marine basins back toward air, marbling the margin with new low islands. Elsewhere, subsidence in peripheral forebulge zones lets the sea claim old moraines for good. The Antarctic we learn in school, white, tabular, locked, is replaced by an austere, fjorded, super Greenland of dark lakes, alpine ranges, and storm-beaten coasts, and by a southern ocean whose chemistry and circulation are no longer the deep ventilating machine of the Pleistocene, but a different engine with different lawful outputs. Greenland today is an ice-armoured mountain ring with a central basin pressed below sea level by the burden of its cap. Without ice, that picture inverts over slow centuries. As melt, runoff and ice stream calving pump fresh water into the subpolar gyre, the North Atlantic stratifies, raising the bar for dense water formation that powers the lower limb of the AMOK. Europe's maritime climates, long moderated by ocean heat export, feel a different mix of sea surface temperatures and storm tracks. Fog banks gather along new shorelines where warm air passes over cold, freshened layers. Meanwhile, Greenland's crust, having carried 2+ kilometers of ice, begins a long rebound. Uplift first leaps by centimeters per year, then eases as viscous mantle flow catches up. Fjords deepen relative to an ocean whose local height also changes under the ice melt fingerprint. Near-field sea level rise is muted because the lost ice no longer tugs the ocean toward it, while far-field coasts inherit more than their share. The interior, once a desert of snow, becomes an archipelago of proglacial lakes that merge, spill and drain catastrophically, while channels incised through till and bedrock toward the sea. Rivers we have only glimpsed today under the ice-carved Grand Canyons across a land reborn, delivering silts and fresh iron that fertilize new shelf seas. Permafrost rings the coast for a while, then yields to shrubs and boreal forest where climate allows. Muskox, caribou, and fox recolonize mosaics of tundra and wetland, while humans chart ports on coasts where glaciers once drove bergs into iceberg chokes. Fisheries rewrite themselves. Cold-loving species fade in the nearshore as stratification and warming push their thermoclines deeper. Caplin and cod jockey with newcomers. Seabirds resite colonies on cliffs that now face open water nearly year-round. The Erminger and Labrador seas host storm systems that mine the new horizontal temperature gradients between freshened coastal layers and saltier offing, shifting precipitation onto a continent downwind that has, itself, been remodeled by transgressing seas. In summer, with sea ice gone and the ice sheet a memory, expansive fetch allows North Atlantic swell to carve unconsolidated coasts into barrier islands and spits. In winter, the absence of tall, cold ice over the centre of Greenland reduces the stationary waves in the jet stream that once anchored certain storm paths. Geological time continues its work, as rebound lifts certain sills. Once marine inlets flip to fjord lakes connected by waterfalls. Elsewhere, the sea invades low passes, cutting new straits that short-circuit coastal currents and create whirlpools of nutrients and life. Greenland's story in a deglaciated world is neither Eden nor ruin. It is a massive, lawful rearrangement of hydrology, physics, and habitat, with a boreal coast that becomes one of the planet's great new laboratories for watching land reawaken from under an ice cap. Raise the ocean by approximately 70 meters, and you don't just redraw the shoreline, you erase and redraw the bathymetry that steers currents and waves. Continental shelves that once broke swell become submerged benches. Sand ridges migrate and dissolve. Submarine canyons extend landward as rivers abandon their old mouths for new. The Bering Sea and Chukchi shallow seas, once seasonal ice factories, are permanent open water feeding the Pacific with cold, fresh inputs. The Bering Strait remains a narrow gate, but its hydraulics change under altered sea level and pressure gradients, modulating the through flow that ties the subarctic basins together. In the Mediterranean, the sill at Gibraltar deepens relative to the sea surface and the basin's exchange with the Atlantic recalibrates. Salt export, intermediate water formation, and the timing of deep convection shift under a new wind and buoyancy regime, and altered river inflows from drowned deltas. The Black Sea rises over its shelves, changing stratification and the redox boundary that makes its deep waters anoxic. Whether this boundary shallows or deepens depends on riverine nutrient regimes and wind stress under a warmer climate. Indonesia's labyrinthine passages, the Indonesian through flow, feel both sea level geometry and wind stress curl changes, altering how much warm pool water leaks into the Indian Ocean and thus tuning the Walker circulation and monsoon couplings. Meanwhile, submerged coastal plains at middle latitudes become near-shore storm workshops. Deeper overshelf waters allow long-period swell to keep more of its energy near the new coasts. Barrier islands will still form where sediment budgets and wave climates allow, but their positions and life cycles are born of new math. Global gyres persist, winds still drive Ekman transport, and western boundary currents still intensify against continents. But their footprints and the places where they peel off eddies are remapped by headlands and straits that didn't exist. The Agulhas leakage, that valve between Indian and Atlantic, might pulse differently if the shelf south of Africa steps down more abruptly. The Kuroshio may meander against a coastline with new promontories that fix or release it. For storms, the toolbox is familiar: latent heat, vorticity, shear. But the playground is different. Broader warm shelves feed landfalling cyclones longer. Cold wakes behind storms propagate over deeper platforms. Baroclinic zones downwind of new inland seas reposition extratropical cyclones. Mariners inherit a planet where old routes are obsolete. New capes, sounds and straits become legendary. And the physics of navigation, swell refraction, tidal windows, fog, are composed in a key no pilot book has yet written, but that remains learnable because fluids obey rules even as the stage changes. The ocean is not only water, it is a buffered chemical system that swallows, exhales, and transforms carbon while exchanging nutrients that set biological production. Melt the ice and you add water plus massive pulses of fresh water and silicate weathering products from newly vegetated and eroding high-latitude land. Over centuries, as coastlines stabilize and weathering ramps, rivers carry bicarbonate and alkalinity that help the ocean's carbonate system absorb CO2 without dropping pH as sharply as it would otherwise. But this helpful buffering unfolds slowly and unevenly across basins. During transition, stratification from fresh inputs suppresses mixing in subpolar seas, starving surface waters of nutrients drawn up from depth. In other places, altered winds, shifting fronts, and changes to internal tides create more or fewer upwelling corridors. Phytoplankton communities respond. Diatoms thrive where silica is renewed. Cyanobacteria expand where iron and nitrogen regimes favor them. The dance between nitrogen fixers and denitrifiers finds a new equilibrium as oxygen minimum zones expand or contract with warming and circulation. Oxygen itself is squeezed in warming, stratified oceans because solubility falls and ventilation slows. Animals that need cool, oxygen-rich water see habitats narrow unless currents or topography conspire to keep windows open. On shelves, drowned soils and peats leak DOC, dissolved organic carbon, and nutrients until microbial communities and sediment dynamics settle. Methane hydrates destabilize along some margins, but most of that methane oxidizes in sediments or the water column before reaching air, a hazard to local oxygen budgets more than a planetary greenhouse bomb. The long ledger, carbonate-silicate feedback, keeps running. Warmer, wetter climates accelerate silicate rock weathering that pulls CO2 down, but that thermostat acts over hundreds of thousands of years, not policy cycles. In the nearer term, human choices dominate the carbon budget. The absence of ice doesn't absolve emissions. It amplifies some feedbacks, permafrost, albedo, adds others, changed vegetation albedo and fire, and eventually introduces negative feedbacks, enhanced weathering and carbonate burial that are too slow to save anything but the geologic narrative. For coastal chemistry, acidification continues to challenge calcifiers. However, estuaries that receive high alkalinity from rebounding, weathering intense terrains may see localized buffering that shelters oysters and corals if nutrient inputs are controlled and hypoxia is kept at bay. The emerging picture is a new ocean autographed by chemistry, different rain ratios of calcium carbonate to organic carbon, different loci of carbon export, different DIC and TA maps that, to an oceanographer's eye, read like the migration of planetary metabolism into a post-ice wardrobe. Societies contending with a long, certain sea level climb have two broad toolkits: move or make room, and design to live with water where you must stay. In the no ice end state, the chronology probably shows all three. Managed retreat is the quiet giant: buyouts, land swaps, and zoning that pre-authorizes future shorelines and corridors, so that as parcels flood, people step back without lawsuits at every turn. Success rests on financing and on building desirable receiving communities upland so that moving is opportunity, not exile. Where critical hubs must remain coastal, ports, refineries, shipyards, engineers layer elevation, floodable ground floors, sacrificial plazas, and surge-compatible boulevards that act as rivers during extremes and public spaces on fair days. Amphibious architecture, structures that float when they must and rest on piles otherwise, graduates from boutique to standard in canal-side districts, while floating neighbourhoods tether to breakwaters and artificial reefs that double as habitat. The energy system follows, floating offshore wind, wave and OTEC in select tropics, plus vast floating PV rafts in sheltered bays, all tied into subsea cables and microgrids built for salt, spray and darkness. Desalination and water reuse bloom, but their energy appetite pins them to abundant clean power. Brine management and intake ecology become as much urban design as utilities engineering. Shore protection reinvents itself away from uniform hard walls, living shorelines, oyster reefs, mangroves, seagrass meadows, stitched into engineered cores that take the largest loads, porous revetments that bleed energy rather than reflect it, barrier islands nourished by sediment bypass systems that keep littoral cells continuous. Where national treasures must be saved in place, historic centres, temples, museums, cities build ring dikes with operable gates and pumps, knowing these are century bridges rather than eternal fixes. Logistics and mobility evolve. Ferries, electric hydrofoils, and shallow draft cargo craft take work off roads. Vertiports and drone corridors handle time-critical deliveries where bridges go long. Insurance and finance embed parametric triggers. Payouts linked to gauges and satellites, stabilizing recovery and incentivizing adaptation, while building codes pivot to performance-based resilience. Structures graded by how they fail, not only whether they stand. Urban nature thrives in the gaps. Blue-green sponges, parks, wetlands, rain gardens, soak cloudbursts, and host birds and pollinators. Night lighting follows dark sky standards so people sleep and stars return. Most importantly, the social architecture, participatory planning, climate service jobs, vocational pipelines, turns adaptation from a string of emergencies into civic identity. The end state coast is not a battlement, It's a negotiated edge, engineered, ecological, and cultural, where water has a seat at the table and cities are drawn with pens that acknowledge tide, surge, and the memory of places now under the gleam. As seas climb and maps dissolve into new ones, law becomes cartography by other means. Exclusive Economic Zones, EEZs, today measured from coastlines and baselines that would drown, must be fixed by treaty or recalculated by principle. Do island nations keep historical EEZs if their atolls vanish, or do rights shrink with land? A just order would grandfather maritime claims for states otherwise erased by physics, pairing that with resettlement guarantees and cultural autonomy in host nations. Migration compacts that treat climate-displaced people as future citizens with continuity of law, not stateless migrants. Property regimes become generational puzzles. Who pays to move a neighbourhood? How do you honour mortgages on land that planners designate as future lagoon? How do you prevent climate redlining where wealth evacuates early and the poor are left to flood? Instruments exist. Rolling easements, transferable development rights, land banks, but they require political courage and public trust. International finance must evolve from disaster aid to anticipatory capital. Multilateral banks underwriting retreat infrastructure. Resilience bonds that monetize avoided losses. Debt for adaptation swaps that free small nations to build higher while preserving mangroves and reefs that protect many. Trade patterns shift as ports move. Customs zones and free trade areas follow them inland. Fisheries treaties switch from static quotas to dynamic allocations that track the moving isotherms and isobaths fish obey. Heritage cannot be an afterthought. Laws need lanes for digital twins of cities, for archaeological triage that records and relocates what can move and respectfully entombs what cannot, and for new memorial practices that let communities grieve and remember underwater places without freezing the future. Equity threads through everything. Adaptation funding must not only fix rich skylines, it must wire and plumb safe, cool housing upland for those who laboured on the old coast. It must ensure indigenous knowledge steers where living shorelines go. It must safeguard right to dark, right to cool, and right to water alongside safety from flood. Even geopolitics, security, basing, straits, rearranges, and treaties must anticipate new choke points where inland seas meet and demilitarize them before frictions harden. Finally, memory becomes policy. Cities partner with artists, historians, and elders to tell the story of the vanishing edge. Schools teach the hydrocivics of why we moved and how we did it. Maps layer time, showing not only parcels, but the ghost coasts beneath our feet. In a world where all the ice is gone, the law that kept us together will be judged not by how it defended lines in sand, but by how it defended people, dignity, and the patient work of living well on higher ground. Remove the planet's cryosphere, and you don't only move shorelines, you retime nearly every inland hydrograph. Glaciers and perennial snowfields behave like buffers, converting winter precipitation into spring and summer meltwater and smoothing the jagged pulse of storms into a steadier seasonal rise. Without that frozen reservoir, mountain catchments swing closer to rain-dominated regimes. When storms come, rivers crest higher and faster. When the sky clears, flows recede earlier, leaving late-season channels warmer and thinner. During the multi-century transition toward a no-ice state, hazards spike. Glacial lake outburst floods, as gel-offs, erupt as new proglacial basins form behind weak moraines and then fail. Thawing permafrost destabilizes hill slopes so that intense rain triggers debris flows where once ice pinned rock in place. But in the end state, those particular cryohazards wane, replaced by a different set. Rain-on-snow events give way to pure pluvial extremes. Atmospheric rivers raise flood stages farther inland because warmer air carries more moisture, and rainfall intensity metrics rewrite zoning maps along foothill fans that have not seen such volumes in the historical record. Groundwater responds with its own slow voice. Along coasts, saltwater intrusion pushes farther inland through sand and karst as sea level redefines base level, contaminating shallow wells unless managed by recharge barriers and careful pumping schedules. Inland, the absence of late-season meltwater nudges irrigators toward managed aquifer recharge, routing winter high flows into spreading basins, floodplains, and injection wells so that water is banked underground instead of pumped away in panic in August. River ecologies swap cues. Salmon and trout that once exploited cold, stable melt windows now hang on in spring-fed refuges or retreat upslope, while warm water species extend ranges into valleys that stay overheated longer. Riparian forests resort by routing depth and flood tolerance. City water utilities, long accustomed to snowmelt hydrographs that crest predictably, diversify supplies. Surface reservoirs at new altitudes, intertide regional grids, desalination where power is abundant, direct potable reuse under modern standards, backed by pricing that signals scarcity without punishing the poor. The legal architecture lags, then learns. Water rights historically written around snowmelt timing are rewritten to prioritize environmental flows, indigenous rights, and human health alongside agriculture and industry, with river compacts embedding climate triggers that adjust allocations when gauge networks report shifts beyond agreed thresholds. Mapping too changes. Floodplains are no longer drawn from bathtub sea level rises and pale flood marks. They are computed from stochastic storm ensembles in a warmer sky, land use mosaics that accelerate runoff, and ground subsidence where aquifers compact. The inland picture, in other words, is not uniformly wetter or drier. It is flashier and earlier, with the slow generosity of melt replaced by a civil engineering promise to mimic what ice once did: store, meter, and share water, using soil, aquifers, wetlands, and law as the new reservoirs. Glaciated ranges are not only white crowns, they are structures held together by ice threaded into joints, talus, and bedded sediments. As that ice disappears, high relief becomes mechanically younger, steeper, looser, more willing to move. Discontinuous permafrost that once stitched cliffs and couloirs gives way. Warm summers penetrate meters deeper. Rock bridges let go. The early centuries of deglaciation are noisy with rockfall, ice-cored moraine failures, and paraglacial adjustment as slopes seek new angles of repose. Alpine lakes bloom in freshly scoured basins, then overspill and carve. Braided preglacial rivers consolidate into fewer, deeper threads. Fans at valley mouths prograde until a threshold flood rearranges them in a single night. Trails and roads cough themselves off ledges that have shifted by centimeters. Engineering adapts with rock anchors, drape nets, flexible barriers, and reroutes that acknowledge a mountain slowly shrugging off its frozen stitches. The economy that grew under these peaks also pivots. Glacier tourism surrenders to lake and cliff tourism via ferrata routes and dark sky astronomy now that moonless nights and cleaner air often reign at elevation. Ski industries shift upslope for a while, then diversify into all-season mountain parks, backcountry hut networks, and gravity cycling. And yes, to winter sports on engineered snow, made by renewable energy and recycled water where climate allows, acknowledging that snowmaking can bruise rivers unless tightly managed. Alpine agriculture makes careful gains. Terraces where glaciers withdrew host hardy grains and orchards. Cheesemaking walks uphill with herds to pastures that hold moisture longer under new plant communities. Agroforestry shades streams to protect cold pools for fish. Biogeography turns over like cards. Plant species climb with climate. Some summit out, others leap to new peaks along ridgelines if land bridges or human corridors exist. Faunal corridors matter more than ever. Wildlife overpasses, no fence grazing regimes, and protected area networks mapped not as islands, but as climate-connected chains that let species move. Mountain hazards become part of civic literacy. Avalanche education morphs into mass movement literacy, with communities trained to read rainfall intensity thresholds, soil moisture, and slope history rather than only snowpack layers. Culturally, the loss of iconic glaciers stings. Pilgrimages that once counted crevasse patterns now count annuli in a trunk, the age of a nascent forest that took the ice's place. Or the clear night when a child first saw the Milky Way from a hut whose ancestors slept under a cornice. The mountains remain sublime. They are simply younger again, with gravity reasserting itself, and with human economies adjusting from white capital to green capital, investing in stability, water, and beauty that does not depend on keeping ice frozen where physics no longer wishes it to be. For Arctic communities, summer sea ice loss is not an abstraction. It is a direct edit to food, travel, and identity. In a world where the last ice seasons are memories, and all the ice now means glaciers, and ice sheets are gone too, coastal lifeways have already turned through several chapters. Subsistence hunters track earlier shore-fast ice breakups, then farewell them altogether. They refit fleets from skiffs to hybrid craft that can handle longer fetch, higher swell, and sudden fog across open water. Reindeer and caribou herders confront insect seasons that start earlier and run longer. Pastures shift under shrub advance. Migration routes must be protected from roads and pipelines that follow new shipping corridors. Language and ceremony adapt. Songs that once timed seal breathing holes now time capelin runs or berry harvests, as artists tell the story of ice through sculpture, weaving, and film, so that memory remains a living thing rather than an elegy. Meanwhile, geopolitics moves where ice retreats. The Northern Sea Route and, in some years, a seasonally navigable transpolar track emerge as commercial temptations for global shipping looking to shave days from Asia-Europe transits. Ports and search and rescue stations dot coasts that were once locked. Oil and gas prospects compete with global decarbonisation trajectories in a tension that can only resolve one way if climate is to remain hospitable. Governance is the fulcrum. The Arctic Council, Indigenous co-management boards, and coastal states must write rules before the rush, not after. Emission standards for ships to keep black carbon off remaining snowfields and to protect air. PSSA, particularly sensitive sea area. Designations that keep traffic out of whale corridors and bird colonies. Ballast water regimes that prevent invasives from hitching a ride into fragile shelves, and binding obligations for oil spill response in a sea where cold, darkness, and distance multiply risk. Fisheries policy must be intentionally precautionary, rather than letting fleets discover a fishery and then attempt to regulate collapse. Nations can set moratoria until stock assessments and indigenous knowledge agree on safe yields and bycatch rules. Above all, stewardship must be local. Indigenous guardians need funding and authority. Data sovereignty should keep monitoring results in local hands as well as in global repositories. Education pipelines should put Arctic youth at the helm of research vessels and planning commissions alike. The polar narrative thus refuses to be only about routes and resources. It is about rights and responsibilities. The right to continue a culture on water that has changed, the responsibility to keep new wealth from becoming old harm, and the recognition that the Arctic's new open water is not an empty highway, but a living sea deserving of the same care once demanded by ice. Warmer air can hold more water vapor, and a deglaciated Earth arrives packaged with higher humidity in many regions. The human body, however, sheds heat primarily by evaporation. When wet bulb temperature, a measure combining heat and humidity, rises past roughly 35 degrees Celsius for hours, even a healthy person at rest in the shade cannot cool effectively. End-state climates do not make every place deadly, but they expand the map of dangerous days, especially in river deltas, monsoon margins, and heat-prone interiors. Cities respond by swapping an ad hoc patchwork of green roofs and fountains for urban thermoregulation by design, high albedo surfaces, deep shade canopies over sidewalks and transit, porous pavements, and blue-green corridors that bleed stormwater into soil rather than into sewers, district cooling powered by clean energy, and building codes that require passive survivability, homes that stay habitable for days without power. Rural labour calendars change too. Agricultural shifts to dawn and night. Machinery takes the afternoon. Heat health early warnings become as common as flood alerts. At the same time, where humidity fails to rise, continental interiors and Mediterranean-type climates, fire seasons lengthen under hotter, drier summers and thinner snowpacks that once damped spring fuels. Pyrocumulonimbus events, fire-made thunderstorms, punch smoke into the stratosphere more often, perturbing radiation and air quality far from flames. Land management pivots from suppression first to mosaic burning, mechanical thinning, and house-out design. Defensible space, ember-resistant vents, metal roofs, and microgrids that let communities ride out public safety power shutoffs. Storm choreography also changes. With warmer seas and broader shallow shelves, tropical cyclones may maintain intensity closer to the new coasts. Compound extremes, coincidences of heat waves with drought, or of surge with atmospheric river rainfall, become the planner's nightmare and the emergency manager's syllabus. Insurance markets either learn to price risk fairly or get replaced by public reinsurance tied to adaptation benchmarks. Communities that reach tree canopy, cool roof, and drainage targets pay lower premiums. Those that do not are not abandoned but are pressed to plan. The physics driving all this is basic. Clausius Clapeyron, boundary layers, fuel moisture. Yet the policy is human. Recognize that a warmer, wetter sky moves both heat stress and flood from rare edge cases into recurring civic challenges, and then build coolth and soak into the bones of streets and fields so people can work, sleep, and thrive when the weather plays its new, lawful hand. Conservation built for a stationary climate preserves places. Conservation built for a shifting climate preserves processes and pathways. In a no-ice world, the strategy must pivot. Assisted migration, carefully relocating species and genotypes along expected climate corridors, steps from controversy into toolkit, guided by genomics that identify adaptive diversity and by risk protocols that keep help from becoming harm. Protected areas grow mobile. Legal instruments define not only polygons, but bands and stepping stones that march upslope and poleward as temperature and moisture isoclines move, with funding that follows the protection rather than shackling it to obsolete boundaries. River restoration abandons concrete boxes for room to move. Floodplains reconnected, meanders allowed. Side channels built so fish and amphibians can exploit varied microclimates as seasons harden. Upstream cold water refuges, springs, seeps, shaded reaches. Get easements and riparian canopy rather than chainsaws. In the seas, new coasts beg for marine protected areas that anticipate where kelp, seagrass and reefs can establish on freshly drowned shelves, and that shield spawning aggregations from exploding pressure as fisheries follow moving stocks. The design lens is connectivity. Biodiversity persists not by freezing vignettes, but by ensuring that genes, individuals, and populations can keep flowing despite roads, cities, and political borders. Technology helps but does not replace humility. eDNA samplers sniff for rare species. Biologgers map migrations. AI reads camera traps at scale. But decisions still rest on indigenous knowledge that knows when salmon once ran and where crane flocks pause in bad winds, memories that can locate corridors better than satellite data alone. Genetic arcs replace single-site arcs. Seed banks are mirrored. Captive breeding programs exchange lineages so reintroductions seed diverse founders. Disease screening becomes as routine as permits because warmer, wetter climates can spread pathogens faster. Funding mechanisms are re-engineered. Conservation trusts buy options on future parcels likely to become habitats. Carbon markets pay for blue carbon restoration in marshes and mangroves that sequester CO2 while damping surge. Biodiversity credits pilot the notion that developers must offset by securing like-for-like processes, not merely acres. And culturally, conservation becomes participatory. Citizen scientists maintain phenology diaries that pick up shifts faster than models. School kids grow riparian seedlings. Fishing cooperatives co-manage reserves that keep tomorrow's catch possible. The animating idea is simple. When ice retreats and climates march, the only durable conservation is movement. And our job is to clear the lanes, finance the crossings, and keep watch with instruments and stories so that the living world's great reshuffling ends not in loss, but in a different, resilient order. Conservation built for a stationary climate preserves places. Conservation built for a shifting climate preserves processes and pathways. In a no-ice world, the strategy must pivot. Assisted migration, carefully relocating species and genotypes along expected climate corridors, steps from controversy into toolkit, guided by genomics that identify adaptive diversity and by risk protocols that keep help from becoming harm. Protected areas grow mobile. Legal instruments define not only polygons, but bands and stepping stones that march upslope and poleward as temperature and moisture isoclines move, with funding that follows the protection rather than shackling it to obsolete boundaries. River restoration abandons concrete boxes for room to move, floodplains reconnected, meanders allowed, side channels built so fish and amphibians can exploit varied microclimates as seasons harden, upstream cold water refuges, springs, seeps, shaded reaches, get easements and riparian canopy rather than chainsaws. In the seas, new coasts beg for marine protected areas that anticipate where kelp, seagrass and reefs can establish on freshly drowned shelves, and that shield spawning aggregations from exploding pressure as fisheries follow moving stocks. The design lens is connectivity. Biodiversity persists not by freezing vignettes, but by ensuring that genes, individuals, and populations can keep flowing despite roads, cities, and political borders. Technology helps, but does not replace humility. eDNA samplers sniff for rare species. Biologgers map migrations. AI reads camera traps at scale. But decisions still rest on indigenous knowledge that knows when salmon once ran and where crane flocks pause in bad winds. Memories that can locate corridors better than satellite data alone. Genetic arcs replace single-site arcs. Seed banks are mirrored. Captive breeding programs exchange lineages, so reintroductions seed diverse founders. Disease screening becomes as routine as permits because warmer, wetter climates can spread pathogens faster. Funding mechanisms are re-engineered. Conservation trusts buy options on future parcels likely to become habitats. Carbon markets pay for blue carbon restoration in marshes and mangroves that sequester CO2 while damping surge. Biodiversity credits pilot the notion that developers must offset by securing like-for-like processes, not merely acres. And culturally, conservation becomes participatory. Citizen scientists maintain phenology diaries that pick up shifts faster than models. School kids grow riparian seedlings. Fishing cooperatives co-manage reserves that keep tomorrow's catch possible. The animating idea is simple. When ice retreats and climates march, the only durable conservation is movement, and our job is to clear the lanes, finance the crossings, and keep watch with instruments and stories so that the living world's great reshuffling ends not in loss, but in a different, resilient order. When seas rise by on the order of 70 vertical meters over centuries, the world's logistics tree lifts its roots and regrafts them farther inland. Coastal ports, the hinges of globalization, do not vanish. They translate. Some slip upslope with dredged approach channels and re-sited terminals. Others are abandoned in place as monumental breakwaters for new offshore hubs. The first order change is geographic. Today's shallow continental shelves, where ports grew because dredging was cheap, drown into deeper roadsteads. The new shoreline often hugs steeper bedrock, complicating quayside construction but reducing siltation. Megaregions respond with inland seaports, rail-anchored dry ports hundreds of kilometers from the coast where customs clears containers, chassis rotate, and distribution centers cluster, turning coastlines into high-throughput transshipment scars and moving warehousing to safer elevations. Maritime routes change too. With Arctic summer sea ice long gone, a seasonal polar corridor matures, not a frictionless highway, but a professionally managed lane with ice-class rules, tug escorts, SAR waypoints, and strict environmental standards. The S-curve of shipping, steam to diesel to LNG to methanol, sails returning as rotor assistance, bends again under carbon policy and fuel economics, favouring large vessels on trunk lines feeding electric short sea feeders that spiderweb new archipelagos and drowned estuaries. Canals adapt or perish, locks are rebuilt to new datums, entirely new cuts become feasible where drowned saddles connect basins, while some famous choke points lose relevance as coasts reconfigure. Rail and road pulse with the maritime shift. Nations braid electrified freight rail from reborn ports to inland hubs, in some corridors replacing at-risk coastal highways with double-stack lines on bedrock benches, while inland waterways expand as backcountry valleys flood into navigable lakes threaded by locks and tunnels. Customs and phytosanitary regimes, once tied to a handful of ocean gateways, disperse across inland nodes, pushing digital pre-clearance and sensorized cargo so that inspection becomes a flow rather than a queue. Insurance, the hidden exoskeleton of trade, recalibrates. Underwriters price compound marine risk, surge plus river plus wind, into port premiums and demand adaptation milestones. Elevated substations, floodable ground floors, microgrid redundancy, before coverage binds. Small economies pivot smartly or suffer. Island states with drowned airstrips and ports must broker baselined EEZ rights and build offshore piers, while landlocked nations perched above the new sea find themselves newly maritime via drowned rift lakes or widened rivers and negotiate corridors with neighbours. And then there is data. Digital twins of ports and corridors let shippers run what-if routings against storm ensembles and strike risks, turning procurement into a resilience craft. The new logistics world is not brittle. It is replumbed. Maritime arteries shortened by polar seasons, capillaries multiplied by islands and estuaries, and hearts, ports, relocated inland where power is clean, elevation is honest and the tide is less a threat than a timetable. Remove the cryosphere and the isotherms rearrange, the growing seasons shift, and the ancient handshake between crop and climate is renegotiated along latitude, altitude, and water. Low coastal plains that once delivered rice, wheat, fruits and vegetables flood or salt, pushing agriculture inland onto terraces, piedmonts, and plateaus where soils are thinner and seasons different. The answer is not a single silver bullet, but a mosaic. Plant breeders and farmers chase moving climates with heat and salt-tolerant cultivars. Photosynthetic pathways, C3 versus C4, are matched to hotter, longer seasons. Perennial grains and deep-rooted legumes are adopted to stabilize soils and store water in place. Agroforestry laces canopies over fields to shave wet bulb temperatures and protect pollinators. Irrigation, once buffered by glacier melt, pivots to managed aquifer recharge and precision watering. Subsurface drip, deficit irrigation, automated scheduling, paced by soil moisture sensors and weather ensembles. Where brackish encroachment is unavoidable, farmers flip land into saline aquaculture. White-leg shrimp, milkfish, sea bass, in integrated multi-trophic systems that pair filter feeders and seaweeds to recycle nutrients and sell carbon credits under verified blue carbon protocols. Uplands take on more fruit and nut orchards as winters warm just enough but still chill. Breeders select low-chill varieties to keep bloom aligned with pollinator phenology. Livestock management follows wet bulb reality, heat-tolerant breeds, shaded loafing areas, evaporative cooling where humidity allows, and altered grazing rotations that rest pastures under drought stress. Post-harvest infrastructure shifts night work from moonlit tradition, which no longer applies, to electrified, low-glare yards and cold chains powered by renewables. Diets, the quiet lever, diversify toward climate-resilient staples, sorghum, millet, cassava, combined with seaweed-enhanced proteins and cultured or plant-based meats that displace methane-heavy production where pastoralism falters. Fisheries migrate poleward and deeper. Governance must be fully adaptive, tying quotas to moving biomass, enforcing bycatch tech, and honouring indigenous co-management where knowledge of currents and spawning grounds predates states. Food security climbs out of single belt dependency into distributed production. Vertical farms and greenhouse belts near cities for leafy greens, rain-fed grains in reoccupied prairies, aquaculture in drowned valleys, orchard agroforestry staircased along foothills, and reef-friendly seaweed forests flanking new coasts. Finance follows function. Resilience bonds and parametric insurance unlock when farms hit tree canopy, soil carbon, and water use targets. Public procurement shifts menus in schools and hospitals to steady demand for climate-proof staples, stabilizing farmer income through transition. And culture at table adapts. Recipes migrate. Festivals keep memory alive for coastal foods now rare, while celebrating new flavors from upland orchards and farms that breathe with a climate no longer gated by ice. As ice retreats, heat, humidity, salt and water reorder the health map. Heat stress deepens where wet bulb maxima push human thermoregulation toward limits. Urban design must treat coolth as infrastructure. Deep shade, reflective surfaces, cross-ventilated housing, and district cooling that functions through outages. In parallel, vector-borne disease ranges shift. Aedes mosquitoes push poleward and upslope, altering dengue, chikungunya, and Zika risk. Malaria edges where nights warm. Tick ranges expand with milder winters, reshaping Lyme and other tick-borne illness. Public health mounts integrated vector management, habitat reduction, larvicides, Wolbachia programs, community water storage upgrades, and couples it to surveillance that fuses genomics to track pathogen lineages with satellite moisture and temperature to forecast outbreaks. Water itself is a twin-edged actor. Saline intrusion corrupts shallow wells, promoting hypertension and preeclampsia risks unless drinking water is desalted or blended. Flood-damaged sanitation spreads enteric disease, and warmer, nutrient-rich waters foster harmful algal blooms that close fisheries and contaminate seafood with biotoxins. Health systems answer with resilient clinics, elevated, solar-backed, passively cooled, and with mobile care that reaches displaced or commuting populations in new exurbs upslope. Nutrition will not escape. As fisheries shift and aquaculture rises, micronutrient profiles of diets change. Fortification and biofortification, iron, zinc, vitamin A enriched staples, are scaled to prevent quiet epidemics of deficiency. Seaweed and bivalves enter school meals and maternal health programs, reflecting new coast economies. Mental health threads through everything. Communities losing ancestral land to the sea experience ecological grief. First responders and adaptation workers carry chronic stress from serial disasters. Children internalize uncertainty. Health policy must name and fund this load. Trauma-informed schools, culturally grounded counselling, green/blue spaces integrated into housing, and rituals of remembrance that validate loss while celebrating agency. Air quality complicates the ledger. Longer fire seasons loft smoke farther. Pyrocumulonimbus events inject soot into the stratosphere. Cities stock clean air shelters, HEPA programs for vulnerable households, and public messaging that treats smoke like heat, predictable, mitigable. Finally, medicine itself relocates. Biomedical supply chains shift inland. Cold chain integrity is hardened against compound floods. Telehealth and paramedicine extend reach across new archipelagos and lake districts. And licensing compacts let clinicians follow migrating populations across state and national lines. Health in a deglaciated world is not a doom curve, it is a design project of streets and shade, of water and waste, of clinics and culture, measured by whether the most heat and flood exposed among us can still sleep, work, give birth, grow old, and laugh in neighbourhoods that the ocean once threatened and now skirts. Glaciers bank water for hydropower. Without them, alpine generation pivots from stable summer melt to flashier inflows and drier late seasons. Operators respond with retimed reservoirs, upstream to downstream coordination, and pumped storage that uses surplus wind/solar to lift water for evening peaks. Meanwhile, the coastline's translation unlocks a blue energy renaissance. Offshore wind steps outward onto deeper shelves with floating platforms. Wave energy arrays mature in archipelagic lee zones where swell is reliable yet survivable. Tidal loses prominence where ranges shrink, but ocean thermal, OTEC, emerges in select tropics with steepened thermal gradients. The grid itself re-architects around meshed offshore backbones, HVDC spines that collect power from fleets and feed multiple onshore nodes, adding redundancy as coasts grow storm-prone. Inland, deserts and steppe host gigascale solar and wind, while rooftops and agrivoltaics blanket cities and fields, the latter shading crops and reducing evapotranspiration. Storage climbs the stack. Long-duration options, iron-air, sodium-sulfur, flow batteries, bridge days. Hydrogen and ammonia serve industry, ships, and strategic reserves. Gravity and thermal stores, pebble beds, molten salts. Smooth hours to weeks, and vehicle-to-grid fleets turn millions of batteries into a responsive sponge. Fossil fuels, if any persist, are hemmed into hard-to-electrify niches with carbon capture, where geology is honest and monitoring is relentless. Desalination scales with energy abundance, but ecology guards its growth. Intake design protects larvae. Brine is diffused or valorized as minerals. Co-locating with power plants and wastewater treatment closes loops. Industry retreats from corrosion's front line by moving refineries and data centers inland or armoring them with alloys and coatings chosen for salt, fog, and heat. Where ocean adjacency is non-negotiable, facilities are built on sacrificial plinths with floodable ground floors and service cores above design surge. Energy justice is baked into the build-out. Communities near new corridors get rate relief, local jobs, and community solar. Island nations receive microgrids that let them ride out storms and exporters' price swings. Adaptation projects are paired with energy efficiency retrofits that cut bills and heat. The physics remains simple: sunlight, wind, mass, electrons. But the system grows muscular and graceful, robust against surge and smoke, balanced across seasons and sectors, and generous enough to run water, cold, mobility, and industry without borrowing tomorrow's climate to pay today's comforts. In the new littoral, salt is not a flavour, it is a design variable. Chloride ions prowl for steel, concrete, electronics, and everything with a seam. The construction canon updates accordingly. Concrete recipes lean on low permeability mixes, supplementary cementitious materials, fly ash, slag, calcined clays, and nanosilica to densify paste. Rebar is epoxy-coated, stainless, FRP, or isolated with cathodic protection. Cover depths increase. Joints are minimized and sealed, and admixtures that bind chlorides by decades. Metals are chosen for exposure. Duplex and super-austenitic stainlesses, where splash and crevice are unavoidable. Aluminum with proper alloys and isolation where weight matters. Thermal spray aluminizing or zinc-rich systems under polyurethane topsides for towers and bridges. Composites proliferate. GFRP, rebar immune to rust in decks and key walls. Carbon FRP wraps that add strength without corrosion. Basalt fibre in rebar and fabrics where fire and heat are concerns. Timber stages a renaissance inland and, with right details, on sheltered coasts. Mass timber kept out of ponding, intelligently flashed and ventilated can outperform steel in embodied carbon and ease of replacement. Where termites and marine borers rule, treatments and design lift wood clear of reach. Sealants, gaskets and membranes graduate from afterthought to discipline. UV and salt-stable elastomers, breathable wraps, and double seal lines with inspection ports become standard. Electronics learn to live in brine air. Conformal coatings, IP-rated enclosures with desiccant breathers, sacrificial boards, and redundant sensors placed so failure is graceful, not catastrophic. Architecture changes shape to shed water and vent salt. Chamfered edges, drip details, pressure-equalized rain screens, and washdown design that invites maintenance rather than hiding it. Stone returns where it makes sense. Dense basalts and granites for armor. Recycled concrete turned to eco-blocks, textured for oysters and seaweeds, so breakwaters double as habitat. Maintenance is acknowledged, not deferred. AI-assisted inspection drones read corrosion fronts. Acoustic emission and fiber optic strain senses fatigue. BIM twins schedule coatings and replacements before spalls, not after. Codes pivot from prescriptive to performance. How many years to first maintenance in C5M environments? How fast can a key be returned to service after flooding? What failure modes are allowed under design surge? and craft matters again. The mason, the diver, the coatings tech, the rope access inspector, all become climate trades, not niche gigs, as cities resolve to live with spray without surrendering to it, building edges that patinate with salt and time but keep standing, serviceable and safe. A planet that lifts its water onto the land demands more than engineering. It demands culture equal to motion. People do not live by flood maps alone. They live by stories, graves, kitchens, festivals, and the names of places where grandparents fished or prayed. When those places drown, two errors lie in wait: erase them or fossilize them. The wiser path is translation. Cities and villages build rituals of parting, annual processions to the old seawall, underwater webcams piped into community centres, archives that collect oral histories before elders are scattered. Museums curate living exhibits that pair artefacts with the skills to make them again. Apprenticeships move with communities so crafts don't sink with districts. Sacred sites are triaged. Some are moved stone by stone. Others are ring-diked for a century bridge. Many are allowed to go, marked by buoys and beacons, and visited in boats on feast days. Language adapts. New shorelines earn old names. The grammar of weather, fetch, swell, surge, enters schoolbooks alongside algebra. Children learn hydrocivics, why their city stepped back, how wetlands guard them, how to vote for councils that keep the promise alive. Art pulls the future toward love. Architects stage amphitheatres that face the new water. Composers write for the infrasound of waves under docks. Filmmakers make epics that begin not with catastrophe, but with crews laying the last stone of a living breakwater that seeded a reef. Grief is honoured, not pathologized. Therapists trained in ecological loss work with neighbourhoods. Memorial grants fund projects that etch the ghost coast in pavement brass lines and AR overlays so walkers can see where streets once ran. Festivals discover new seasonal anchors as climate rebounds toward a different beat. Harvests migrate upslope. Fleets bless aquaculture as they once blessed trawlers. Astronomers lead dark sky nights reclaimed by lighting reform. Inclusion is Polestar. Migrants are not warehoused. They are welcomed into woven neighbourhoods with schools, clinics and jobs, and they bring food and music that enlarge the receiving city rather than wait in suspension for an old ward to reappear from the sea. Law helps culture breathe. Design review protects vernacular textures even as materials change. View corridors to water are common right. The right to dark, right to breeze, and right to water are codified alongside safety. In the end, meaning is what outlasts our hands. A world without ice is still a world with home. If we choose it, one that remembers where it came from, tells the truth about why it moved, and teaches children to read the tide not as a thief, but as a partner in the ordinary miracle of living well on higher ground. When shorelines migrate tens of meters vertically and many kilometers horizontally, a coastal megacity does not merely defend or surrender, it translates. The blueprint that emerges across continents is a family of urban typologies tuned to geology, hydrology, and culture. Cliff cities anchor on bedrock escarpments where elevation is honest and foundations are reliable. Their waterfronts are funiculars, switchback streets, terraced parks, and hoists that lower freight to new quays built on caissons. Terrace cities step gently up old floodplains in benches, each bench a hydrologic district with its own retention ponds, pumping galleries, and overflow parks that accept sacrificial inundation during compound storms. Streets become blue-green corridors that are creeks in a squall and promenades on a fair day. Canal cities arise where subsiding lowlands are too valuable to abandon. Here, ground floors are designed to flood safely, utilities run high, and neighbourhoods are stitched together by electric ferries, boardwalks, and amphibious architecture that floats when it must and rests on piles otherwise. Archipelago cities spread across new islands and drowned ridges, linked by light rail causeways, cable ferries, and wildlife-friendly bridges. Their edges are breakwaters that double as oyster reefs and linear parks, changing storm physics while growing dinner and habitat. Farther from the sea, inland port cities, dry ports, become the logistic hearts that customs clear containers, rotate chassis, and distribute goods to markets. Old coastal terminals, partially drowned, survive as offshore transshipment, scars feeding short-sea electric feeders. Housing follows the topography and the law. Mass timber mid-rises and modular buildings bolt together quickly in receiving districts, cutting embodied carbon and speeding occupancy. Social housing is interspersed with market units rather than exiled to the periphery, because what kills cohesion in a century-long move is segregation, not altitude. Codes flip from prescriptive to performance. Dwellings must remain habitable for days without grid power. Passive survivability. Must shed heat passively under heat waves and must either float or fail gracefully under design floods. Mobility unlearns car primacy. Rail becomes the skeleton, electrified regional lines binding port, work and hills, while surface transit is BRT, with shade, bike highways under tree canopies, and walkable grids that keep errands within 15 minutes at human speed. Water transit is no longer postcard novelty, but daily bread. Hydrofoils, catamaran ferries, and workboats stitched to the transit grid with the same punctuality as trains. Logistics burrow and soar. Service tunnels carry power, fibre, and district cooling below. Aerial freightways, compact cable systems, move pallets over wetlands where roads would wound. Stormwater management is not an add-on, it is the street plan. Permeable pavements, rain gardens, detention plazas, and sponge schools that become neighbourhood shelters when pumps struggle. Zoning admits reality. Rolling easements pre-authorise future shorelines, and transferable development rights move value uphill before panic auctions hollow communities. The informal city is welcomed as partner rather than policed as problem. Community land trusts, incremental housing finance, and cooperative utilities pull self-built neighbourhoods into the adaptation project so that the city that rises is more just than the city that sank. In short, the translated megacity is not a fortified relic. It is a new organism whose bones are rail and terraces, whose skin is shade and reefs, and whose metabolism is water managed in the open, so everyone can see how the future works. If ice is the great sculptor of continents, sediment is the mason we still have. In a world without ice, deltas and coasts relearn the trade of building and holding land with the materials rivers deliver. The playbook begins upstream. Watersheds are managed to keep soil on hills and send the right grain sizes downstream, reforesting headwaters, contour farming, terracing, and beaver-style waterworks that slow peaks while preserving supply. Downstream, engineers and ecologists conspire to steer sediment where it counts. Controlled river diversions cut into levees at safe locations to let floods spill across sinking plains, dropping mud in broad fans that rebuild delta lobes over decades. Between floods, sediment pipelines move dredged material from ship channels to marsh platforms and barrier islands designed to grow under rising seas. The golden rule is continuity. Breakwaters and jetties are built porous. Groins are short and offset, and inlets are kept healthy with bypassing systems so that the littoral cell keeps feeding its own. Where waves and surge need a partner to spend themselves against, living shorelines replace bare concrete. Oyster reefs seeded on textured blocks. Mangrove benches stepped so saplings can catch silt. seagrass meadows re-established behind low-crested structures. These systems absorb energy, trap fine sediments, and create nurseries, adding layers of benefit that a wall alone cannot. Sediment isn't the only currency. Carbon is too. Coastal wetlands, marshes, mangroves, peat are profound blue carbon vaults. Protecting them and letting them migrate landward under rolling easements locks up carbon while furnishing surge protection and fisheries. Inland, peatland. Rewetting halts oxidation that would otherwise belch CO2. In agriculture, biochar returns carbon to soil while improving water retention, and enhanced weathering of silicate rock on cropland, applied carefully with monitoring, pulls small additional CO2 down while buffering soils. To make any of this scale, measurement and markets must behave. MRV. Measurement, reporting, verification, moves from PDF to platform. Satellites and in situ sensors track accretion, vegetation, and carbon flux, so credits are real. Credit registries require permanence and community consent, preventing land grabs disguised as climate action. On the ground, the craft is practical. Barge masters learning new channels, fishers co-managing reefs that now guard their villages, dredge crews placing material thin lift to avoid smothering marsh, school kids with quadrats counting seagrass shoots. Mistakes will be made. Overbuilt structures that starve downdrift beaches, diversions that flood fields, but adaptive programs bake in learning loops, changing gates, flows, and forms as sediment answers. The larger ethic is humility. We cannot command coasts to hold a line against physics. We can work with flux, keeping sediment moving, giving space for water to linger, and paying people who live at the edge to be its stewards, because the cheapest levee is often a wetland that someone tends, and the strongest wall is a ridge of shells grown patiently by a community that has decided to stay. When forecasting the world after ice, the past is not a prophecy, but a teacher. The last interglacial, often called the Eemian, roughly 125,000 years ago, was warmer than the pre-industrial era, with global mean seas several meters higher than today. Beach ridges, fossil coral terraces, and marine notches cut into limestone whisper that coasts were drawn farther inland even without human-made greenhouse gases. Go deeper to the mid-Pliocene, several million years back, and many reconstructions suggest global mean temperatures warmer than today by a few degrees and sea levels far above modern shorelines. Estimates vary, but the message is consistent. With enough warmth held long enough, big ice retreats and seas respond. Paleoclimate archives, ice cores, foraminifera shells, leaf fossils, pollen, isotopes in cave dripstones tell a coherent story about feedbacks and timescales. Ice sheets do not vanish at the snap of a finger. They melt, flow, and carve in ways modulated by bed topography, ocean heat, and buttressing shelves. The ocean stores heat at depth and releases it slowly. The carbon cycle chews on perturbations through weathering, sediment burial, and biology across tens to hundreds of thousands of years. Atmospheric CO2 in the Pliocene was comparable to or somewhat higher than current values in many reconstructions. What differs is the duration. The system had time to equilibrate to a warmer boundary condition, and the ice found its new balance. From this, 3 sober lessons emerge. First, commitment. If we push greenhouse gases high and hold them, seas keep rising long after emissions stop because ice and oceans are slow machines. The end state we are imagining is not fantasy in physics terms. It is a question of how warm and how long. Second, variability. Even in warm periods, climate danced, Monsoons shifted, storm corridors moved, deserts breathed in and out. The end state is not meteorological monotone, but a different orchestration with familiar instruments. Third, signals and limits. Fossils show tropical and subtropical life flourishing along coasts where today we keep cities. Boreal forests and tundra migrated. Wild ancestors of modern species ranged, adapted, and sometimes failed. Humans were not yet engineers of worlds, but the Earth they would one day inherit has worn these clothes before. Caution is warranted in the analogues. Continental positions, gateways, and orbital settings were not identical. We cannot photocopy the Pliocene, but the direction of travel is clear. The more we resemble those greenhouse climates in energy balance, the more our coasts resemble their maps. Paleoclimate's gift is not fatalism, it is context, a reminder that the planet's response is lawful, paced by large masses and deep cycles, and that our choice is how close we sail to those old shorelines by what we put into the sky and how fast we take it back out. Engineering is the easy half, consent is the hard half. Cities and nations that must move neighbourhoods, redirect rivers, and tax today for assets their grandchildren will finish need a politics that prizes trust. That begins with maps that tell the truth, sea level fingerprints, subsidence, storm ensembles, and timelines published openly, updated when the gauges say so, and explained in plain language at kitchens and in council chambers. Risk communication must retire the false precision of single lines on maps. Instead, it shows bands of probability and the decision points attached to them. If the tide gauge reads X by year Y, we open the diversion gate. If it reads Z, we trigger the buyout program. Budgets follow the same transparency. Public money builds levees, reefs, rail and housing. Procurement is clean or adaptation rots under scandal. Anti-corruption membranes, open contracting, disclosure of beneficial ownership, citizen oversight boards with teeth become as vital as pump stations. Because adaptation will inconvenience and displace, legitimacy also requires fairness. The first neighbourhoods protected must not always be the richest. Setback lines must come with funds to move, not fines to punish those who cannot. And receiving districts must be built first, with schools, clinics, parks, and transit, so that moving is an upgrade in safety, not a downgrade in dignity. Citizen assemblies and Indigenous co-management boards move decisions out of narrow rooms. They do not guarantee harmony, but they surface trade-offs early and publicly. Which wetland to sacrifice to save a hospital, which boulevard to turn into a canal, which history to move stone by stone. Misinformation is a hazard in its own right. Bad actors will claim that floods are hoaxes, that buyouts are theft, that moving a shrine is sacrilege. It will sometimes be true that governments stumble. The countermeasure is not censorship, it is competence on display, projects that work, dashboards that do not cherry-pick, and leaders who admit error and course correct. Adaptation fatigue will set in, taxes paid, detours driven, memories pried up. Politics must pace itself with wins. Parks opened, nights cooled, fish returning to new reefs, with anniversaries that celebrate milestones, and with sabbaticals for frontline staff before burnout steals institutional memory. The private sector is harnessed by law, not flattery. Insurers conditioned to offer coverage when cities meet resilience benchmarks. Developers permitted to build only when they contribute to public works. Utilities regulated to bury lines, flood-proof substations, and share data. Ultimately, the social license for a century-long move rests on whether ordinary people feel seen and served, bills manageable, rents fair, streets shaded, buses frequent, water clean, work near. If that compact holds, the politics holds. If it frays, No seawall is tall enough. The macroeconomics of a no-ice world are not only a ledger of losses, they include a large, persistent adaptation dividend if we invest with discipline. Capital formation reorients from short-lived sprawl to long-lived infrastructure, electrified rail, meshed grids, water reuse, living shores, and dense, cool housing. These assets raise total factor productivity by cutting travel time, slashing energy losses, and reducing the drag of disasters that would otherwise reset progress every few years. The job map shifts accordingly. Millions of skilled trades, masons, divers, coatings techs, reef builders, instrument installers, hydrologists, arborists, become the backbone of a climate-era middle class. Apprenticeships and vocational colleges grow as important as four-year degrees, and immigration policy smartly invites the crafts we lack. Finance invents instruments for long horizons. Resilience bonds pay out when gauges hit triggers. Green banks co-finance efficiency, and rooftop solar for low-income households. Adaptation credits, distinct from emissions credits, reward projects that demonstrably lower risk for many, not for the few. Central banks and supervisors run climate stress tests that treat sea level fingerprints and heatwave productivity losses as core to credit risk. Mortgage markets stop pretending 30-year loans are blind to 30-year water. Insurance evolves or yields ground to public reinsurers. Parametric policies settle on weather thresholds rather than opaque loss adjustment. Coastal coverage is contingent on meeting benchmarks for shade, drainage, and elevation. Business models move shoreward or inland with creativity. Tourism pivots from vanishing glaciers to living coasts. Snorkel trails on restored reefs. Heritage dives on mapped ghost cities. And dark sky observatories upland where nights are cool and clear. Agritech and aquatech industries export desal, aeration, and recirculating systems. Materials, companies scale low-carbon cement, stainless and composite supply chains, and recycled aggregates for habitat blocks. There are losers, speculative sprawl on sinking soils, stranded assets in refineries or ports that refuse to move, and extractive finance that seeks quick exits after storms. Policy can dull the pain. Just transition funds, wage insurance, portable benefits, and relocation stipends help workers retool and relocate. Critically, maintenance becomes macroeconomics. We budget not only to build, but to keep. Coatings refreshed, pumps overhauled, reefs reseeded, so that assets deliver their design life. Corruption, if tolerated, eats the dividend. Every leaky contract is a seawall hole. But competence compounds. A city that cools streets, cuts losses, and moves freight cleanly becomes more competitive. Firms cluster, tax bases stabilize, borrowing costs fall. The iceless Earth is not an economic sentence. It is a growth strategy contingent on whether we treat adaptation as a system, not as shiny one-offs, and whether we count success not by ribbon cuttings, but by quiet days when the power stays on. The buses are full, clinics are cool, and the sea and the city keep their truce. Strip the planet of permanent ice, and you do not strip it of home. You redraw coasts, retime rivers, and loosen the grip of seasons that once depended on snow, but you do not erase the deep grammar of Earth. Rock cycling, heat upward, oceans trading warmth and salt with wind, life metabolizing light and mineral into forests and reefs, people arranging themselves into neighborhoods, markets, festivals, and vows. Across these acts, a pattern appears. Where physics is slow, ice sheets, mantle flow, patience is policy. Where physics is fast, storm rain rates, surge, redundancy is policy. We have seen how sea level fingerprints and isostatic rebound make rise uneven, how AMOC and storm tracks retune, how wet bulb thresholds and fire regimes complicate comfort, how sediment and blue carbon let coasts fight for themselves, how health, food, trade, energy, and law can either lag and break or move and mend. We have sketched cities that stepped back and kept soul, economies that found work in the making and keeping of safer places, and cultures that refused to choose between remembering the lost and loving the new. None of this is guaranteed. A world without ice approached recklessly is a world of avoidable tragedies, botched retreats, unjust protections, hollowed-out towns, and politics that mistakes delay for prudence. The same world approached deliberately is a world of competence, instruments that watch honestly, budgets that fund maintenance, rules that protect the vulnerable first, schools that graduate reef masons and instrument techs alongside poets and nurses, and civic rituals that keep faith across decades. The choice we face is not whether oceans rise, they will under any warming we fail to avoid, but whether the rise is a thief or a partner. A partner, if we give water room, if we let wetlands migrate and rivers breathe, if we terrace rather than wall, and if we learn to celebrate a night where stars are visible again because we designed light with care. A thief if we pretend nothing must move, if we spend public money to trap the poor in floodplains and free the rich to run, if we let distrust rot the institutions that must steer a century. In the end, the 2-hour story you just heard is not a prediction. It is a briefing for a civilization that wants to stay civilized under new lines on the map. The work belongs to us, to measure, to argue in good faith, to decide, to build, to maintain, to welcome, to remember, and to teach. If we do those things, plain things, hard things, then an earth without ice is not an epitaph. It is a chapter in which we prove that we can live with water, with heat, with difference, and with one another, well enough that the children who inherit our terraces, our reefs, our railways, and our stories will find the planet rough in places and beautiful as ever. Across this journey we imagined a planet without permanent ice and followed the ripples, coastlines translating upslope, cities replotted as terraces, canals, and archipelagos, rivers retimed without the slow generosity of melt, oceans repatterned in currents, chemistry, and life. We traced physics at 2 tempos, the slow, patient edits of isostatic rebound and deep ocean heat, and the fast surprises of surge, cloudbursts, fire, and heat-humidity stress. We saw how food belts remap, how trade regrafts inland through dry ports and rails, how energy leans on wind, waves, sun, storage, and meshed offshore grids. We learned that adaptation is not just walls and pumps, but living shorelines, sediment stewardship, blue carbon, cool streets, and homes that stay habitable when power falters. We named the civic scaffolding trust, transparent gauges, maintenance budgets, fair laws, mobile conservation, and care for culture and memory, because competence and equity decide whether rising water is a partner or a thief. The headline is simple: Earth remains home if we measure honestly, design humbly, build wisely, and take everyone with us. Thank you for watching, and good night.